with your attendance on this rather warm and muggish day. At the same time, however, I must confess that I am not very greatly surprised that so many of you have ventured the heat of the day to gather. I know full well that there have been a great many rumors, much speculation, and if the truth be told, a great deal of fear, anger, and despair which has been spreading, and not only throughout the capital city of Williamsburg, but throughout the entirety of the Commonwealth of Virginia, owing to our present very troubled state of affairs. And so therefore, with the hope of perhaps shedding forth for you some light upon the subjects at hand, and perhaps too to offer forth some comfort and succor unto the ladies here present, Mr. Speaker, Benjamin Harrison has suggested that I make some few brief remarks to you concerning our present circumstances. I have never in my life been much known for speaking briefly about anything. Frankly, I dare say no one knows this better than Mr. Speaker himself, but nonetheless, I shall endeavor to the best of my abilities in accordance with his wishes, and particularly as this might very well be my final public address in the city of Williamsburg. But first, permit me to make polite introduction of myself for those of you who are not yet known to me. My name is Henry, Patrick Henry, Jr., Esquire, your most humble and obedient servant to command. And it has been my very high and unmerited honor to have served as your first governor of the Commonwealth for these last 3 years past, since we separated ourselves from the Crown and government of Great Britain. I have endeavored to serve you diligently and well. The reason that I say that this might very well be my final audience in this city is owing to two things. One of them constitutional in nature. You must know, friends, that we did learn a thing or two from our days under royal authority. To remind you, our royal governor was not elected, but rather was appointed by the king. Never native born to Virginia, heaven forbid that. He could hold the office of governor for as long as he lived or as long as he wished. And furthermore, he had the power of all three branches of government in his one pair of hands. We saw how that led to trouble. And so we've taken great pains to ensure that that will not be suffered upon our future generations. For by our new constitution, a man might hold the office of chief executive for no more than 3 consecutive one-year terms, at which time he must stand down to private station for at least 4 years, to remember from whence he came, before he might hold the office of governor again. Well, as I was first appointed to this office in June of 1776, this now being June of 1779, clearly by the bounds established in our Constitution, I'm required to vacate the office, and frankly will do so with considerable happiness. There's a second reason, too, that this might be my final address in this city, and that's owing to an act recently passed by our General Assembly, specifically removing the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond Town. Now, this is not the first time that this question has come about. Some of you may be old enough to recall that back in 1747, there was a fire which destroyed the Capitol building. And at that time, because our population was beginning to spread westerly, the question was then raised before the legislature that perhaps we should take that opportunity to remove the capital to someplace more centrally located in Virginia so as to be more convenient for those men who, like myself, lived in the more western reaches. Oh, but the power of the Tidewater elite was still very great in those days, and so by only 2 votes it was determined that the capital would remain in Williamsburg, and thus a second capital was built upon the foundations of the first. This time, of course, we're not planning to move the capital to Richmond for reasons of anyone's convenience, but purely and simply for the reason of homeland security. I needn't remind you that Williamsburg is situated on a rather narrow peninsula. Just 2 miles yonder is the Deepwater York River. 2 miles yonder is the mighty James. Both of these rivers can very easily accommodate large British ships of the line, those large 60 and 80 gun vessels, and thus, if Williamsburg continues to stand for our capital, why the British Navy could cut us off from the rest of the Commonwealth without having to fire a shot. Now, it is reasoned that as Richmond Town is situated at the fall line of the James River, that those ships would not be able to penetrate into the city, and thus it's believed it will be far more easily defended. The removal of the public records will begin in the next several weeks, but I'm confident it will be some months yet before the business of state resumes in Richmond Town, and obviously will not fall upon my watch, but rather upon the watch of my successor. As to my successor, I will frankly state before this polite company that Mr. Jefferson was not my personal choice to follow me in the office of governor. Now, please do not misunderstand me. I'm highly affectionated towards Mr. Jefferson. He, I believe, towards me. After all, we've worked in close concert one with another over these last several years, and frankly, I've known him since he was but a boy of 17 and about to wend his way here to Williamsburg to attend the College of William and Mary. And in fact, I've often had the rather odd suspicion, being 7 years his elder, that he often views me much as he would an older brother. which can at times present its difficulties, mark you. Envy and jealousy of the elder brother's accomplishments on the part of the younger, even to the point of leading to fratricide. I certainly hope it will not come to that. But frankly, whereas I'm the first to admit that Mr. Jefferson is a man possessed of many great gifts and talents, minute attention to administrative detail is not one of his attributes, and he furthermore has confessed to me upon several occasions that he despises and fears confrontation more than he does death. Well, having served in this office myself for these last 3 years, friends, I can attest that there is a great deal of confrontation in the office of the Chief Executive of Virginia. But I comfort myself with this, I pray you as well, that he will have about him his Council of State, 6 good men, and 3 of those already tried and true in the operations of the executive branch. He is certainly a very dear friend to liberty, and with their advices, I am confident will exert his every diligence in seeing to the happiness and the safety of our people. Alas, I would that I were leaving Mr. Jefferson under better conditions and circumstances. Our economy is in a shambles. Our trade has come to a complete standstill. Our manufacturing is non-existent. Our money is depreciating by the hour. Indeed, a bushel of wheat or a chicken costs 20 times more today than it did this time just 1 month ago. We're still embroiled in a most brutal and savage war with the most formidable adversary the world has ever seen for these 4.5 years. There's still no end to it in sight. And as a result of the expenses of this very costly endeavor, we're facing a national debt that we never dreamed possible. And we in Virginia have finally felt the real sting of British might, too. In that just several weeks ago, there was a very large, most unexpected incursion of some 1,800 British regulars and Marines that landed at Portsmouth, a 3-day ride to the south and east of here, about 90 miles. The 100 regulars we had in place there at Fort Nelson were clearly outmanned, and so were forced to evacuate the fort. The homes of the citizens nearby were first plundered, then put to the torch. There were a number of vessels, both naval as well as mercantile, that were either carried off by the enemy to add to their own fleet or were burned where they were moored. 7 Frenchmen murdered in cold blood. And then as soon as the British had completed those atrocities at Portsmouth, they then marched on to nearby Suffolk and did the same thing all over again, bringing with them, as they do everywhere they go, the smallpox and a pestilence of flies, the likes of which has not been seen since the book of Exodus. I suppose, given these very dark circumstances we're presently facing, it might be natural that some of you might be having some misgivings about that decision that we made here in this city back in May of 1776, when in the Capitol building in the 5th Virginia Convention, myself a delegate at that noble body, Virginia became the first former British colony to officially and publicly declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Perhaps you believe that we erred upon that occasion. Perhaps you believe that we should have surrendered a little bit more of our liberty in order to enjoy the security of being subjects to the crown of Great Britain, the most powerful nation in the history of mankind. My friends, despite these very gloomy circumstances we presently face, I urge you nonetheless to recommit yourselves to that better world that we envisioned back in May of 1776. To remind yourselves that the building of a republic such as ours, a self-governing nation, establishing an environment of liberty and equal justice under law for all men, not only the wealthy few, is certainly not a project of days, but rather one of decades. I would urge you, too, to remember that the mark of a true patriot is one who understands and accepts that with the enjoyment of personal rights also comes the responsibility of fighting for said rights through bad times as well as good. And lastly, remind yourselves of the series of usurpations that brought us to this unhappy pass in the first place, that led Virginia, ever considered the most loyal and affectionate of subjects to the crown, knowingly, lovingly, and affectionately known as the Old Dominion for well more than 100 years, Virginians who have been described by a number of English authors as being more British than the British. What was it that led Virginia to become the first to declare her intention to separate from the crown and government of Great Britain? I cannot help but be reminded every time I wend my way through the city, as I did on my way hither, of a gentleman who served the people of Virginia most honorably for well more than half his life. I speak of old Dick Bland, Colonel Richard Bland of Prince George County. He'd held a seat in the House of Burgesses for 33 consecutive years. He was renowned pamphleteer, certainly influential in the forming of our Declaration of Rights and our new Constitution. And in fact, it was before that Fifth Convention adjourned that he collapsed dead in the street in front of Mr. Charlton's coffee house, dying in the service of his country. It was back at the time of the Townshend Act, I believe, that he once likened the philosophy of the British government to have changed over the last several generations to resemble that of the old nose under the tent stratagem. Now, for those of you who may be unaware of this ancient fable, it has to do with a traveler in the far distant land of Araby who's crossing the desert upon his camel. And when night falls and it becomes cold and dark, he erects a tent for himself, which is large enough but for him alone. Whereupon his camel says to him, "Oh, but master, 'tis bitter cold without. I know there is not room for both of us within your tent, but may I place my nose within it, that I might warm it at least by the fire?" Being a kindly man, the master allows the camel so to do and proceeds to sleep. But throughout the course of the next several hours, the camel continually roots his nose ever further within the tent, so that by the break of dawn the camel is within the tent and warm, the master pushed without and frozen to death. My friends, it does not require the penetration of an Isaac Newton to discover that that indeed is the very same stratagem being employed by Frederick Lord North, still the first minister of the government of Great Britain, and all of his wicked minions and imps within the ministry and parliament. Consider, if you will, that series of abuses, the violations upon our personal rights that we have endured since the end of the late war with the French, concluding in 1763. The proclamation line of that year, the Sugar Act of 1764, the Hated Stamp Act of 1765, the Declaratory Act of 66, the Townshend Act and its duties of 67. Does one begin to see a pattern emerging here? The Tea Act of 1773, imposing yet another unconstitutional tax directly applied by Parliament upon the people of these American colonies in violation of the British Constitution. It was that illegal tax that prompted an incident in the harbor at Boston in December of 73, where in a noble effort to protest that unconstitutional act, a number of men took it upon themselves to destroy 45 tons of East India tea into the harbor at Boston. It is said there is still no fish to be sighted within 7 miles of Boston's port. What followed that, though, was something that no one could imagine that a loving king would do unto his most loyal and dutiful of subjects. Instead of simply rounding up those responsible individuals for that admittedly criminal action, His Majesty determined instead that he would punish each and every man, woman, and child in the entire colony of Massachusetts Bay by giving his royal assent to what were most justifiably called the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The Royal Charter of Massachusetts revoked, replaced instead with a military government, martial law decreed, the quartering of British troops within the homes of the citizenry. Indeed, 1 out of every 4 souls in the town of Boston, an armed British mercenary, lurking at every street corner and crossroads. All civil rights which we had long cherished as freeborn Britons were deprived of every soul in the entire province. Trial by jury, the right to freely assemble, the right to a free press, the right to have free and open elections, the right to keep and bear arms, all of those and all others besides, stripped away from every soul in the entire colony. All the while, of course, the threats being daily made in the halls of the British government that the rest of us throughout America could expect much the same rough treatment if we continue to do what we as Britons have done for 5 centuries since the time of the Magna Carta, standing with manly firmness and insisting upon our God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Most offensive of the intolerable acts, the Boston Port Bill, wherein it was determined that a fleet of British warships would sail into Boston's harbor and seal it off to all traffic, both in and out, resulting, friends, in the starvation of thousands of innocents within that place. Women and children who had nothing to do whatever with the destruction of East India tea. Here at home, ever His Majesty's most affectionate subjects, though we had long detested New England men on general principles, nonetheless understood that the closure of their harbor was going to cause terrible suffering and misery. And so what did we do as our last act as a colonial legislature? We resolved for a day of fasting and prayer that we might appeal to Almighty God to avert civil war with our mother country. And for that virtuous act of piety, love, and affection, our government was dissolved. never to meet again as a colonial legislature. Shortly after that, Lord Dunmore, our royal governor, fled in cowardice and disgrace in the middle of the night, and for the next year took up a new lifestyle, that of being nothing more than a pirate, the likes of which we have not seen in Virginia since the days of Blackbeard, stopping ships, molesting their passengers, carrying off slaves, raiding plantations for provisions, stealing cattle, burning what he couldn't take himself, threatening to burn the capital city of Williamsburg to the ground, firing upon Jamestown, Hamptontown, putting the torch to Norfolk, and worst of all, in November of '75, stealing a printing press from young Mr. Holt and forcing a couple of pressmen to print a proclamation, which, among other things, offered freedom unto your slaves and indentured servants who would run away from you and take up arms with Dunmore against you. As I said at that time, oh, you may put a 3 pence per pound tax on tea and Virginians will remain indifferent, but you threaten to arm our Negroes against us? That did it. That's what brought us here, my friends. Nothing less than this, a question of freedom or slavery. And so once again, despite these gloomy times we presently face, I beseech you to recommit yourselves to that better world we envisioned back in May and June of '76, to stay the course being always to liberty and to ever keeping preserved that most precious of all worldly blessings. For it is a virtuous cause, indeed, a most holy one, divinely ordained. And should we stay this course together, ahead I do see a land of the greatest of promise and prosperity, a land in which you and all of your future generations will ever enjoy the smiles of freedom and peace, where the rich production of America's agriculture shall wave in every field, and our commerce shall whiten every sea, in tints so bright, so strong and glowing it will set your souls afire. I have no doubt that Almighty God will shine forth all his power and glory in your redemption, for you are clearly become his newly chosen people. But virtuous and ever vigilant ye must needs be, and stay the course to liberty. For God grants liberty only to those who love it, and who are always ready to guard it and to defend it. And I pray you, be not ever afraid. For as it says in the good book, fear is the passion of slaves, and Virginians will be slaves to no master. Stay the course, I charge thee.
Huzzah.
At this time I should wish to proffer forth my profoundest apologies to the ladies here present. For speaking so warmly of matters of politics, I know you have very little mind or inclination for such things.